gentleman, the member for Edinburgh North and Leith. I welcome the debate. I support the conclusions of the report undertaken by the committee, of which I'm proud to be a member, and I congratulate the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Gordon on his presentation of our findings. Moreover, Mr Gale, I would like to thank all of those who made our visit the seamless success that it was. There was a terrific committee operation undertaken before, during and after our visit, and that all contributed to the success of the work. Let me say at the outset, Mr Gale, what seems to me to constitute a relevant context for this debate. The egregious abuse of human rights of the long-suffering people of Burma has become ever more widely known, not least since the truly despicable catalogue of events in September of this year. By contrast, the incidence and the depth of the poverty of the people of Burma, I put it to honourable and right honourable members, are relatively less familiar to people in this country and around the world. Yet there is, of course, a crucial link between the fact of the abuse and the prolongation and exacerbation of the poverty. And it is, as I say, that set of phenomena, the extreme disregard for human rights on the one hand, and the truly breathtaking poverty and destitution on the other, that offer the backdrop to the decision to launch the inquiry in the first place, and to the work undertaken on and the findings produced by our report. Let me just focus on those two phenomena for a moment or two, if I may, Mr Gale. Rape as a weapon of war, extrajudicial killings, compulsory relocation, forced labour, the use of child soldiers on a scale proportionately greater than in any other country of the world, the use of human minesweepers, religious persecution, the incarceration in conditions of quite unspeakable bestiality of thousands of political prisoners, excruciating water torture, and the wanton destruction of more than 3,000 villages across eastern Burma over the last decade and more, are all part of the institutionalised savagery that has caused the military junta of Burma to stink in the nostrils of decent people across the globe. Yet how many people actually appreciate the extent of the poverty which is endemic and pervasive in Burma, from which literally millions of people suffer? I suggest that there is still a considerable ignorance of its extent. So let's remind ourselves and inform others for the first time of the scale of the problem with which we have as policy makers or attempted influencers of policy to contend. A third of the people of Burma exist, I won't use the inappropriate word live, on less than a third of $1 a day. A half of children in Burma do not manage to get through and therefore benefit from as much as 5 years in school. 1 in 10 of the children of Burma dies before he or she reaches the age of 5. Since 1990, 80,000 women and children have been trafficked from Burma to Thailand, as documented and testified to by the International Labour Organization and by the International Programme for the Eradication of Child Labour. On top of all that, 340,000 people in this country of Burma are living with AIDS. So that is the scale of the crisis that faces us. And I put it to colleagues that it is no disgrace, but it is something of a regret, certainly on my part, that because of the very proper focus on and preoccupation with sub-Saharan Africa, of which this committee, the government and the House can be proud, there is a tendency sometimes to disregard, to underplay, or simply to remain ignorant of the fact of the simultaneous coexistence of peoples in other countries outside sub-Saharan Africa who endure poverty on a comparable scale. And I think it is a matter of historical fact that Burma has suffered from a disproportionately low aid budget over decades under governments of both colours. I am not for one moment making a partisan political observation here. I think that when Conservative governments have been in power and when Labour governments have been in power, this problem has been grotesquely under-recognised. Just to give an example, Burma receives an aid budget which is approximately a quarter of that afforded to Zimbabwe. It doesn't remotely compare with that of appropriate nameless, who might be thought to be suitable comparators, Laos or Vietnam or Cambodia, to mention just three that are in close proximity to Burma. An aid budget, until amended and uplifted, of $2.40 per person per year is frankly an insult to the suffering of the people of that beautiful but beleaguered country. And so I want to say at the outset, on the subject of the aid budget, that I'm in a positive spirit, that I think it is proper to appreciate progress, and that I want to pay tribute to the government for the announcement that it made to double the aid budget. That announcement on the 29th of October, I say unquestioningly and without hesitation, was an extremely welcome move, and the Secretary of State for International Development is certainly entitled to claim credit for it. I do cavil somewhat at the choreography of events in recent times. I think the Right Honourable Gentleman Mumford Gordon has an extremely pertinent point, quite why it was necessary first to issue what I would describe, Mr. Gale, as a relatively downbeat governmental response, which gave the impression of cocking a snook at the committee and having less than a fulsome respect for our work or our findings, only then, a matter of days later, to make this announcement for all the world as though it was something which the double first brains of the Department for International Development had entirely of their own initiative devised, is not immediately apparent to me. But I don't want to dwell on the point any longer. Suffice it to say that the committee approves of what the government does, and if the government accepts the logic of its doubling, and that leads to a quadrupling, at which possibility the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State himself hinted during the course of DFID questions yesterday, then I think we would have good reason to offer not 2 cheers, but 3. Of course I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Mr. Battle.
Could I say to the Honourable Member that I think the committee are grateful to him as well, because he has championed Burma and our committee and made sure that we did a report on him. We thank him for that and the pressure that he put on. But I'm sure he would agree with me that there is always, as well, a dilemma. It's easy to say aid and a government give aid, but how many countries in the world, as soon as they move to dictatorship, do we then meet campaigns saying withdraw the aid? Because the real difficulty is ensuring that that aid reaches the people that need it. Going through governments is not always possible. Even getting NGOs in is sometimes not possible. And it might mean that we have to look internationally, together, much more imaginatively of how we support the poor in Burma than simply saying that government programmes will do it, because they can't.
Mr. Bercow.
The Right Honourable Gentleman makes a perfectly valid point, Mr. Gale. If we are going to uplift the budget to the tune of a doubling by 2010, and to hold out the reasonable prospect that quadrupling from where we are now by 2013 is to be delivered, as the Select Committee recommended, and as Her Majesty's Conservative Opposition is committed to deliver, it is absolutely right that you have to have that much more transparency, that much more concern about accountability, that much more satisfaction in your own mind that the mechanisms exist for the effective and efficient, including cost-efficient, delivery of the aid, which is, after all, available only courtesy of the British taxpayer. So I accept what the Right Honourable Gentleman says on that front. I would just like to focus really on 3 points of particular interest so far as I am concerned in a report which I think deserves commendation. First, it was very much a hot issue of debate within the committee and as between some different witnesses whether there should be an increased focus on the delivery of cross-border aid or not. I make no secret of the fact, Mr Gale, that I've long been a partisan of the view that there is great scope for increasing cross-border aid and that it would be quite wrong for Britain unilaterally to depart the scene on the frankly unsatisfactory ground that other countries were delivering cross-border aid and that it was not therefore necessary for Britain to do so. Given our strength in the area, given the importance we attach to the issue, given the pronouncements that both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have made in recent months on the subject of Burma, not to mention those of the Secretary of State for International Development, it would frankly be absurd if we were simply to abdicate responsibility and say, well, others can do that. We should most certainly be increasing resources to the Thailand-Burma Border Consortium, but recognising too that there are other organisations that are involved in the delivery of cross-border assistance. It isn't just the TBBC. And when we listened to the verdict of the witnesses in front of the committee, there was a very strong current of opinion that said, if a greater resource were provided, we could do much more, notably in terms of the delivery of health services and the provision of immediate medical relief, but also in other respects, notably by assistance on the education front with the provision of materials and in some cases of teachers to boot. So I believe that that ought really to be a priority in the period ahead. I was disappointed that in the government response to our report there was no real sense of urgency on the part of ministers, nor even a clear declaration of intent to increase cross-border aid. Instead, the government took refuge in the argument that a United Nations OCHA assessment was being done, pending the completion of which it wouldn't be appropriate to commit further. I don't actually think that line of argument is satisfactory, but before I explain why, of course I'll give way to the Honourable Lady for Glasgow.
Alan McKagan.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for allowing me to give way. Can I just say that, or suggest to him that it is vital that there is one central coordinating body in terms of aid both within Burma and also cross-border work, and that the United Nations is really the primary body to organise and to carry out the mapping exercise, given the fact that some donors do not operate within Burma at all, such as the United States of America, which is one of the major donors. And the UK is only one of a very few donors who actually operate within the borders. But I fully accept that there is a need for the UN to get its act together quickly, and that all sides in the international community should be putting the maximum pressure now on the United Nations to make sure that mapping exercise is carried out without delay, so we can all make the proper, efficient decisions on how we put our donor money.
I have a feeling, Mr Gale, and I may be mistaken, time will tell, that the Honourable Lady will not have to wait long. My expectation is that the results of the mapping exercise will be forthcoming very soon. A little bird tells me that the work has been undertaken, though even there I confess to a degree, a tinge of disappointment, because my expectation was that there was to be a mapping exercise which would be countrywide, Mr Gale. That is to say, that those undertaking it would be taking an overall view, a holistic stance on the subject of the delivery of cross-border aid, the requirement for it, the capacity to deliver it, and the efficacy with which it could be done by comparison perhaps with other mechanisms that might be available. My impression so far is that there has been something less than a full piece of work. It is a relatively partial piece of work, and I'm not certain that it will consider the issue so far as all of the borders are concerned. That would be a great pity. Our report was, of course, into DFID assistance to Burmese internally displaced people and refugees on the Thai-Burma border, but we were, of course, able to draw lessons from what we learned, which are potentially of wider application to people who are living on or in close proximity to other borders with Burma than simply the Thailand-Burma border. So I'm a bit worried about this because I think that the government itself has been very hesitant and neurotic about the subject of cross-border aid. I have a feeling that there has been a ready supply of excuses for inaction and inertia. The government has tended to say that it has this comparative advantage, deploying what you might consider to be almost an economist justification for its priority in policy, which is not validated by a study of the facts on the ground. Moreover, there's been a bit of an inclination within government circles, though I think that this might be in the ether, a characteristic of some officials rather than particularly a conscious decision of ministers, to play down the numbers of people who can potentially benefit from the delivery of the cross-border aid. There's been a move to say, well, of course, it is only about 100,000 people, it's only 0.whatever% of the population of Burma as a whole. And I think that that has given the impression that some people want to rubbish the notion of cross-border aid. It's a thoroughly misguided position to take, because the truth of the matter is that there are some people who are in extreme poverty and at grave risk to their security, who can be reached, Mr. Gale, only by the mechanism of cross-border aid, and for whom in-country assistance will simply not avail. That's the first point, and therefore, in a sense, almost whatever the numbers, if it is the priority to help most those who have least, which should presumably be a defining characteristic of the responsibility of the Department for International Development, we ought to be focusing on those people, in a sense, irrespective of their number. Secondly, however, there is a tendency to think that it is simply a matter of the internally displaced people. But it isn't a matter only of the internally displaced people. There are a very substantial number of people within Burma who are not internally displaced, who are living in their initial and perhaps long-term homes, who are, frankly, on the edge. They've got absolutely nothing. And the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Gordon referred to this earlier as a characteristic of many people in Burma. Can't eat, can't drink, can't access health care, can't get to school. By whatever yardstick you choose to measure poverty, you would have to say that these people were genuinely destitute. So I hope we're going to help them, and I hope that there can be an announcement soon. And I hope that if the UN OCHA report doesn't cover the whole of Burma, the government wouldn't for one moment consider arguing that further such studies at multilateral or other level, conducted over a period of several months or even years, were required before a policy decision could be made to extend the principle of the delivery of cross-border aid over the Thai-Burmese border to other borders. Let me say to the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State that there is a pressing need for the provision of such cross-border assistance over the India border into Chin State, and reference was made by the Honourable Gentleman, the member for North West Leicestershire, who is no longer in his seat, to the privations of the people of Chin State. He was quite right to highlight that phenomenon, Mr. Gale. I went to the India-Burma border with Christian Solidarity Worldwide, notably in the company of Baroness Cox of Queensbury and of the Asia Advocacy Officer for CSW, Ben Rogers, in September of this year. I was there from the 14th to the 21st of September. Be in no doubt of the extent of the difficulties faced by people in or fleeing from Chin State. Some estimates are of 70% of the population living below the poverty line. Thousands of people have fled Chin State and are now living in Mizoram in northeastern India. A good many have gone to other places besides. And amongst those who continue to reside, not in any sense, in anything approximating to safety in Chin State, Mr. Gale, there is definitely a need for assistance. And given that just as there is capacity to deliver aid across the border from Thailand, there is capacity across the border in India, I would hope that we can do the work. There are the backpack health workers teams, and they are applauded for the sort of work that they do. And what I want to underline to the Minister, Mr. Gale, is that for a relatively modest expenditure, you actually get a terrifically effective bang for your buck. I'm talking about the expenditure of, I think, $1,254 providing for an estimated 2,000 people living as IDPs or in similar circumstances in Chin State for a period of 6 months. So you can spend a little and gain a lot, and the consequence, the benefit, is immediate. You are having a relief of poverty, you are saving lives, you are providing access to food, you are ensuring proper health care, you are facilitating the provision of education to children in Chin State who would not otherwise receive it. So I hope that that message can be taken clearly by the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State. And I would add that it would complete the symmetry if the government were to commit on the India-Burma border, because the Secretary of State for International Development wrote to me in October of this year, and he referred to an intention over a period of 4 years to provide £1.35 million for cross-border health programmes on the China-Burma border. That was something of which previously, Mr Gale, I was unaware. If the government is determined to go ahead with that, I say that is extremely welcome. But if they can do it over the China-Burma border, they can certainly do it over the India-Burma border. I was in no doubt, either as to the efficiency or as to the transparency of the organisations and individuals who would be charged with that responsibility over the India-Burma border. There is a related issue, and that is the support for exiled democracy groups. And I want to focus on this very briefly. The government, in its reply to the Select Committee report, said that it was prepared to entertain applications for funding, subject to the caveat that organisations seeking funds for undertaking pro-democracy work, for delivering advocacy services, for seeking to cultivate the strength of civil society, would have to bear in mind that they would need to meet the criterion of poverty reduction. Because apart from anything else, that is a legal requirement under the International Development Act. What I would say to the Parliamentary Secretary of State is that I understand that, but I think that it is up to the government to take a broad view on this subject. The Department for International Development funds civil society programmes in a plethora of different developing countries, including least developed countries around the world. It is not always easy to prove an absolutely axiomatic, precise or mechanistic link between the provision of funds to an organisation that campaigns for human rights on the one hand and the immediate visible relief of poverty on the other. I do think it's one of those circumstances in which we have to deploy a degree of common sense. Obviously, if you're talking about organisations that document, publicise and then campaign against the pervasiveness of rape in Burma, Mr Gale, I should have thought that in battling as those organisations under huge pressure and on a shoestring do for greater assistance from individual governments and at multilateral level, they are contributing to the process of poverty reduction. And so I would say to the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State that, of course, individual applications must be considered on their merits. Organisations have to be prepared to fill in forms in the proper way. They have to demonstrate transparency. They have to prove accountability. They have to behave efficiently. And their integrity must be beyond suspicion. But there are lots of candidates that could benefit. I refer, of course, to the Shan Women's Action Network and the truly magnificent and redoubtable Charm Tong, who is an inspiration to anyone who meets her. That organisation has previously been greeted with indifference or, I'm sorry to say, even froideur from officials, and I emphasise some officials at the Department for International Development, and Mr Gale, that must change in the future. I am extremely heartened by the attitude that the Parliamentary Secretary of State has taken, and that has been demonstrated by the Secretary of State. Please look at that organisation if they submit an application, because they're a brilliant organisation. They're trying to help suffering women. They have got a superb track record, but they have felt so utterly discombobulated from DFID officials, or rather they have thought that DFID officials are so utterly discombobulated from them that they thought it, frankly, simply not worth the effort in a hard-pressed group to put in an application when they've been told privately, frankly, you haven't got a chance. That situation is not satisfactory, and it is time for reform. I mentioned that organisation, but what about the Karen Women's Organisation? What about the Women's League of Chinland, whom I was privileged to meet on my visit to the India-Burma border in September of this year? The Assistance Association for Political Prisoners. I mean, that does fantastic work. Why do we know so much about the character of the abuse of prisoners in Burma if it weren't for that organisation? It was people linked to that group, Mr. Gale, who informed me of what I regard as probably one of the most horrific individual stories that I've heard about a prisoner in Burma, somebody who was in insane prison and who was so desperately malnourished, so ravaged, so inadequate as a consequence of his treatment, and so painfully thin that the investigator who went to look at conditions in the prison was reported subsequently in public to say that he could see the man's intestines moving like worms. Now, you don't get that information into the public domain unless you've got conscientious individuals, sometimes at some risk to themselves, who are prepared to do the work from time to time undercover and then to report their findings. Those organisations deserve public finance. Finally, I just say to the Minister that I thought it was very welcome that the Prime Minister on the 16th of October this year wrote to the Secretary-General of the United Nations and held out the possibility of an international or multilateral economic package that could potentially be made available to Burma if, and only if, there was demonstrable evidence of a commitment to immediate change. Quite how you develop that package is a matter for debate. I should have thought that it could indeed contain provision for debt relief, for trade facilitation, for re-entry to the international economic system. It could possibly contain some funds to contribute to preparation for elections, to the development as necessary of the activities of political parties and those of civil society organisations. All of those matters can be discussed in due course. The money couldn't be given prematurely. That would be disastrous. Equally, it shouldn't wait too long. So it's a fine judgment as to how you put together a suitable and flexible package which is properly calibrated and which can have the desired effect of pushing a country that is teetering on the brink of a genuine commitment to change decisively in that direction. The fact that the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary of State for International Development are talking in those terms is very welcome. Our report is good. The government's response was a bit disappointing. Government utterances since have been very encouraging. Can I say in the politest possible way to the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, who signed robust motions on Burma in the past, not least at my request, I think, when he was a backbench member, that I wish him well in the execution of his responsibilities. I do not wish to sound menacing, merely the candid friend when I say to the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, a rising star in the brownite firmament, that the International Development Select Committee will continue to be on his case.